And so it's Oscar, Knight of Astoria, who provides us with the closest material grounding we get in the entire game in 10 or 11 seconds. And I think it's important that I provide you with a bit of narrative schizophrenia, basically. Think of two entities, player and player character. The player holds the controller, the player character, and now this is the player's avatar. She follows the player's command. As the player and player character continue on their journeys, these parallel paths fuse into one entity through the alchemy of video gaming. Watch it happen, right? But if we go back, imagining at the game's outset that the player and player character have not yet merged, it is important to note that our player character is unaware of the game's grounding narration, all of which likely amounts to ancient history relative to the character's lifespan. While the player receives the narration, the player character only receives grounding from Oscar, which constitutes the first in-game interaction, and thus the basis of the player character's best available knowledge of his present situation. This should be our foundational text for understanding the world. Let's listen in. Here's what Oscar says. Regrettably, I have failed in my mission, but perhaps you can keep the torch lit. There is an old saying in my family, "Thou who art undead art chosen." In thine exodus from the undead asylum, maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know. Now I must bid farewell. I would hate to harm you after death. So go now, and thank you. It is possible to play through the game again and again and again and again and not fully understand what he is saying. Arguably his speech is not quite meant to be understood, buried as it is beneath layers of native localization decisions and undoubtedly also by Miyazaki's mirthful and elliptical sense of narrative play. This has a somewhat paradoxical effect in which Oscar's physical presence and the tone of his voice have become familiar. They have become beloved enough to the point he is on plushies, while his message and background themselves remain blurry and out of focus. In the strictest sense, it should be said that Oscar's role signals the acceptance of the quest from a gameplay design standpoint. Oscar's speech to my mind has 4 certain prongs. The first being family, the second being undead, and the third and fourth, which kind of tie together, are pilgrimage and the fate of the undead. This talk is only going to cover the first prong. So, number 1, family. Oscar has a family. Oscar's family partakes in a social context in which proverbs exist about the undead. It is important to see Lordran and Astora as being on 2 different poles of a large process of social degeneration. Likely in Oscar's background, undead are a spiraling contagion set against a more normal and traditionally identifiable mode of life, while in Lordran, society has evaporated to the point that such symbolic play is irrelevant. Who built the asylum? First, it is important to note that the asylum is in the north. We are told undead are being corralled into the north. In the mythological context Miyazaki is drawing on, the Middle Ages in Western Europe, the north was culturally and symbolically associated with the edge of civilization, a total wilderness in contrast to the perceived order and sanctity of the Mediterranean world to the south. Keep this in mind. Before we can answer the question of who built the asylum, we must establish where the asylum is in relation to Lordran, the land of the gods. Lordran is the home of the gods, not accessible to anyone but the chosen few, while the undead asylum is part of the human lands. The raven can transfer the undead from the asylum to Lordran. Once again, it is important to see Lordran and Astora as being on 2 different poles of a large process of social degeneration. The asylum would appear to exist at a nexus point between the end of Oscar's civilization and the tail end of Lordran. The effects of Gwyn's flame dying out have begun to impact Oscar's world. Solaire says that time is stagnant. Stagnation stretches back in time. You would have thought Oscar's world was as over as things get, but it is in fact 100 to 130 years before the player character enters Lordran. The key phrase here is again, family. By invoking the word family, however, Oscar tells us that he lives in a world where there are still normal social relations and reproduction of the species. In this context, questions of who built the asylum and what it's like where Oscar come from are easily answered. Oscar betrays himself to be anchored in a world which still values social relations over the always looming pinprick of violence, where people still voluntarily associate with one another instead of being atomized totally into constant hyperviolence. This all matters because this paradoxical division between the player character and the player double back and serve as the portal between Oscar's world and ours. Oscar is in fact a time traveler from the past, and it is against the vague, highly personalized, internal Rorschach test of the word family that we silently measure the rest of the game after entering the world of hyperviolence. Oscar's words are a cipher incantation, much like Pavlov's bell, which silently triggers the alarm in our heads which says, "It's dark, souls. Now let us begin."